Hello, today we are going to focus on topic 7.1, Introductions to Natural Selection. So before we begin, I just want to make sure that we understand the concept that individuals do not evolve, populations evolve. And you'll hear me say this again and again and again. So the way that you are born is the way that you are going to die. The next concept is that evolution does not have a direction. So in other words, there's no perfect plan that evolution has. Evolution is the response to the environmental conditions. The environment picks the winners and losers. If the environment changes, the population is going to evolve accordingly. We'll focus more on that as we continue. The last concept I want to look at is the term fitness. Now, most of us, when we think about fitness, we think about athletic, or how fast we can run, how much we can lift. But when we talk about evolution, fitness is referred to an organism's ability to survive in the environment and reproduce. So, natural selection is a major mechanism of evolution. In my diagram here, you will see a population of beetles. The majority of the beetles are green, and there's 3 red ones in our population. Now, interestingly, the red ones have a selective advantage because our bird there likes green beetles. That's its favorite. And so you can see over generation after generation after generation, we see a decline in the green beetles and an increase in the red beetles. They have a selective advantage to eventually the point at which the birds eat all the green beetles and we see a population shift where the red ones are the only beetles that are left. So these have a selective advantage. The environment has selected the winners, the red beetles, and the losers. When we talk about natural selection, we always have to start with Charles Darwin. He really can be the one who considered the concept of natural selection. He first introduced the world to this concept when he published The Origins of Species. So Darwin was an English naturalist, which that means he went around collecting specimens. And in 1831, he joined a voyage on the HMS Beagle, which traveled the world for 5 years. And the purpose of this voyage was to basically map the coastline of South America. And while he was there, he spent lots of time in South America collecting and studying plants and animals, bones and fossils, and he sent all these back to England where he later continued studying them. But while he was in South America, they made a quick pit stop to the Galapagos Islands. And the Galapagos Islands are a relatively new collection of islands just off the coast of Ecuador. And these were formed by volcanic activity. And because they're a relatively new landmass, the animals there were just fascinating to Darwin. He saw these tortoises, he saw plants, he saw lizards, things that he just never seen before while he was in South America. But what really caught his eye were the birds. Most of the birds were about the same size. However, when you looked more closely, they all had different beak shapes and sizes. And at the time, Darwin thought these were all different birds. And so as he collected them and sent them back to England and studied them later, what he quickly realized is that these were all finches, and that each finch beak correlated to the type of food it ate. And he believed that the survival and reproduction of these birds was an adaptation to the food sources available on the island. So, his conclusions are as follows. He believed that a small population of finches, which originally came from South America, landed on these isolated islands. Now, just like the human population, all the finches were not the same. They had variation in their beaks. And it was this variation that enabled individuals to gather food successfully in the different environments on the islands. And after generation, the populations of finches changed both anatomically and behaviorally. In other words, they evolved to better gather the food in the resources in the areas of the island that they lived. And it was this accumulation of advantageous traits that allowed those individuals to better survive and better reproduce in those populations. And this is this concept where Darwin first believed the emergence of different species. To further confirm this hypothesis, what we see here is the original common ancestor of the finches from the South America. From there, depending upon the traits that those birds brought with them to the Galapagos and the areas of the island that they lived, they evolved different characteristics to gather food. You can see here on the left-hand side, these birds all had the same shape of beaks that allowed them to better gather seeds. In a similar manner, these birds here all had beaks that allowed them to better eat the flowers on the island. And last but not least, these birds with their long, narrow beaks all evolved to eat insects. But you'll notice that these all came from a common ancestor. So, on the left-hand side there, you can see this is a sketch that Darwin had in his lab book, and it says, "I think." And you may have seen this now in popular culture. But this was the first idea where Darwin came up with this concept of what we call descent of modification. In other words, organisms descend from a common ancestor that lived in the remote past. So in other words, where you came from. Now, interestingly, Darwin didn't use the word evolution, but he rather used the word descent with modification. And Darwin believed that natural selection was a mechanism for evolution. And that's really demonstrated here in the middle of the slide. You can see the modern day elephants, the Asian elephants, and the African elephants. And you can see over evolutionary time, if you work our way backwards, you can see the different stages of ancient ancestors to the elephants. Many of these have now gone extinct. So, these are the 5 observations that Darwin made during his trip. First, the idea of inherited variation. So in other words, there is lots of variation in the population, and we know that. We all have different hair color, eye color, heights, and we get these characteristics or variations from our parents. So we inherit them. Your eye color, your hair color, that is all from your biological parents. Competition. Now, when I talk about natural selection, most students bring up the idea of survival of the fittest, and that's really where this term comes in, the idea of competition. So in other words, species produce way more offspring than the environment can support, and we know that. There's only a finite amount of resources available. And because of that, some of the species or some of the individuals are going to be able to feed themselves and produce lots of offspring. Others are going to not have the resources and won't be able to reproduce and probably die. Selection. As I said before, the environmental pressures select the winners and losers. So just in my first example there, where I had the green beetles and the red beetles, because of the selective pressures of the environment, the birds liking the green beetles, the red beetles had a selective advantage. And so they were able to reproduce more efficiently, and that led to the shift in the population. Adaptation. Just as I said before, all individuals have different variations. So there's some traits that are beneficial, such as the red beetles, red being beneficial. And because of that red color, they're able to produce more offspring and survive greater in the environment. And lastly, evolution. So over generation after generation, now there could be millions of years or it could be very short, there's going to be what we call an allele frequency change. Now when we talk about alleles, we'll focus more on this later, but basically those are just changes in characteristics in the gene pool. So those that are more advantageous, they're going to have more offspring, and because of that, they're going to produce more of the population that looks like them. So we're going to end here. There will be a second video on the continuation of this topic 7.1.